Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. Let me briefly check if everything's working all right on my iPad. Today, as you can see, I'm streaming from my mom's place. I'm visiting family over a longer weekend, so I might actually be streaming from here early next week, depending on the rumors that we're going to discuss today, if they will actually turn out to be true early next week. I'm actually so happy about this. My March, especially the end of March and early April, are completely full, so I would actually have to skip covering the iPhone SE4 if it actually were to launch, for example, very early in April, and would have to delay it by like mid-April before I could cover any of it. But actually, we have some really good news from Mark Gurman. Seems like my stream is working. Should not be internet limited today like I was yesterday for some reason. Because yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it correct. There is a chance, and it's not a guarantee, and it does line up with some rumors we've heard before, though not previously rumors from Bloomberg's Mark Gurman, but now they are. And that is that the iPhone SE4 will come supposedly next week, or may launch next week. It's still the iPhone SE4 we have talked about all this time. So it would have Apple's first 5G modem. It would have a notch similar to the iPhone 13 notch with Face ID embedded in it. So no Touch ID, no alt 4.7-inch LCD panel, a 6.1-inch OLED display, USB-C, very important so that European sales don't really drop like hell, because they are now forbidden from selling Lightning iPhones in the European Union. We already have a few chats going on. Relay2K joining. I'm here early this time. I'm really looking forward to having the stream with you, Relay. Riveting Tail Chap saying for the algo, and Steve joining in that chant but claiming for Frodo. I absolutely agree with both. And Angelica joining the streams, also saying she is punctual as usual, and she's wishing all of us some nice fun and a good stream. Thank you all for joining already. I know this is a little bit bigger piece of news, but it's also very sudden. Usually, like I would expect it maybe by Sunday with the Power On newsletter by Mark Gurman. My audio quality might not be perfect today. I am recording through my earpods, so please forgive me. Usually I have my very nice Shure MV7 Plus. Not today. Meow. My cat is here, by the way, too, so she might say hi, but I do think she's angry that I'm not playing with her right now. And what's interesting, of course, as always, is the way that Mark Gurman phrases these certain things. He says the company expects to announce the device as early as next week, ahead of it going on sale later in the month. I mean, that makes sense. Next week is middle of February, and then if it becomes like available for pre-order the week after, and then for available for sales the week after that, that absolutely makes the sense that kind of does. But I find it funny when he says the company expects, like, yeah, I mean, if the company made a plan, that's what they expect. But like when you say something like is expected, it almost sounds like there's a possibility it could not happen. But if it's something the company decides, then it's not really something the company expects anymore. Like, especially if it's in the very near term future. Like, for example, Rockstar Games currently expects to release GTA 5 by fall of 2025, GTA 6, right? But some stuff could change, it could be delayed. If we're talking about shit that could be happening in 4 or 5 days, I would definitely be inclined to believe that Apple just knows it's going to happen. So this is according to people with knowledge of the matter. So probably some salesperson or maybe some higher up executive. Again, Mark Gurman never really tells us what kind of sources he uses, but which is probably for the best for the sources. So I'm not too angry about that. The iPhone SE4, as you can see here, so we are looking at thicker bezels than the current iPhone 16 lineup. We are looking at the notch, no dynamic island. We don't know what other compromises Apple would target, especially in comparison to their premium models, like single speaker system maybe, no full Qi 2 integration, like no magnets around the wireless charging system. Those are the details I'm really interested in. I'm also very interested in knowing how that 5G modem actually performs. Ramon asking if I'm pronouncing correctly, MacBook Air M4 when? Well, that's interesting because neither the M4 MacBook Air, which we expect, of course, to get this spring, nor the M3 iPad Air, and I'm using a lot of air quotes here because we simply don't really know what the next iPad Air is going to be like. To be honest, I wouldn't even have expected to get a new iPad Air up until like the end of the year maybe, but supposedly we are getting a new iPad Air some point in the early on in this year. That was even like something Mark Gurman said. It would get like Apple's Wi-Fi modem, right? So it would get like Wi-Fi 6E, but it's like cheaper for Apple, obviously, to use their own modem than using the Broadcom Wi-Fi 6E or Wi-Fi 7 modems. It would supposedly have some design tweaks to work with a newer Magic Keyboard, but it was never clarified if that Magic Keyboard is the same as for the M4 iPad Pro. So the entire launch of Apple's like non-iPhone SE devices now seems very nebulous to me because like I don't think it really makes sense to announce the iPhone in February and then still have something in April. Apple could probably announce the iPhone this month and then have the iPad and the Mac coming out like next month and then in April. So basically every month has like a decent Apple device launch. But I'm not sure, like that to me just looks very confusing. Mark Gurman said MacBook Air M4 will come before spring. Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's very, very questionable. Like where did all the previous rumors about the April launch came from? Did Apple like push everything forward? Did they maybe see that even that? To me, the reason why that doesn't make much sense though is just in their Q1 2025 financial earnings, they talked about how the M3 MacBook Air, so they said the most recent MacBook Air, right? So by that point, they don't yet have an M4 version, right? Is selling really well because of certain value changes that they made to it. Ergo, they gave it 16 gigabytes of base memory, right? So if that one is selling well, and they even mentioned the iPad Air positively, which right now is an M2 based system. My question is, do they really want to kill all those sales and they really don't want to sell out of inventory worldwide before they move on? I'm not sure. Maybe sales are not quite as good as they would want them to be, so they're just moving on to the next thing. The iPhone SE makes all the sense to me to push it forward. Apple does not really have a very compelling $500 to $600 system right now. $600 I refer to like the higher end configurations, right? So that would be like the iPhone SE4 with maybe 256 gigabytes of storage. Apple does not have Apple Intelligence on their cheaper iPhone models, and obviously Apple Intelligence is a big marketing push for them right now. Apple does want to put their new modem into the hands of many people so they can actually start getting some real world results, see how it performs across the world. Obviously, I'm very sure they've been already doing internal testing, but the more data they can collect, the better they can make the next version. And the next version will be a more high-end 5G modem that would be like powering supposedly like the iPhone 18 Pros. So the iPhone SE4 and of course Europe, as I already said, Lightning iPhone sales are no-go anymore in Europe. So if they launch this with USB-C, that's already a big step forward. And especially in a market even like Europe or China or India, where there's a lot more competition from Chinese brands than they are in the United States, then of course they will need finally a higher value product than the current current iPhone SE 3. I heard SE 4 will come in February 11th. Well, yeah, and that's because some people say it will launch alongside the next Power Beats earbuds, and those are rumored basically exactly for February 11th. Now, whether or not that means Apple has to launch them on the same day, I mean, February 11th is like 8, 9, that's on Tuesday. So, I mean, in theory, Apple could have a jam-packed week with like Power Beats announced on Tuesday, the iPhone SE 4 announced on Wednesday, and then on Thursday they announced the MacBook Air or the iPad Air. I have no idea how they will like schedule it all out. Or they maybe launch the iPhone and the Power Beats on one day, then the iPad, and then the Mac, and then they just have an entirely jam-packed week. AKA Mark said next week, and they launch on Tuesday. Press release. Yeah, they, by the way, when I say they will announce something, I do mean press release, which is also why I'm really looking forward to this, because I myself know that it's much better for my viewership if I react to a press release than if it is me reacting to a live stream, because live streams are just like, they're copyrighted, people prefer to watch them themselves. Apple has so much confidence to launch it on the press release. Nah, I think that, like, don't forget, the M4 Max launched all with press releases, right? Like, they launched in Apple's newsroom and basically on Apple's website. I don't think that launching something not in an event means that Apple doesn't trust in it. I just think it's not big enough for its own event, especially if it's not a huge heap of products, right? They will still have videos for it, like this is our new iPhone SE 4. They will still have ads for it. They will talk probably about more Apple Intelligence stuff in those videos, right? They will say something like, the iPhone SE 4 is our most affordable iPhone ever to get into Apple Intelligence. And with it, we're also launching, that might not be in the official video, right? But that's something they could talk about. It's like, by April, it will have access to Apple Intelligence in all those new languages, including a new Siri version, right? And people will once again complain that, like, Apple talked about something in their videos that is not actually on device day one, similar how the iPhone 16 series only got Apple Intelligence like a month later. And I will once again have to say that, yeah, it's fine to give a product some updates a month later and talk about those updates early on, because people don't pay attention like throughout like a full launch month. They just watch a video, they know, oh, it's a new product. Apple can say new Apple Intelligence stuff is launching a month in or 2 months after the release, and I think people will be fine. Then they should release iPhone SE 4, MacBook Air, Air 4 M4 at the same time. You know, yeah, I actually do think they should bring out all of those things. The things I asked of whether or not the iPad Air M3, the MacBook Air M4 right now to be launched make a lot of sense is because of the financial stuff that Apple has recently talked about. To be honest, if we look at the most recent piece of data, is it actually would line up that we might be getting definitely the MacBook Air, but also maybe the new iPad Air much sooner than expected, and that is the fact that their supply at Apple stores, at least, maybe in third-party stores, they still are selling out of their own inventory, right? So they might not have like the immediate like response to like, oh, Apple stopped supplying, that means we have no inventory. While Apple stores, they have a faster sell-through rate. Usually you will feel it once Apple stops producing something, right? So seems like supply for both the M2 iPad Air and the MacBook Air. Now, they do not specify whether we are talking M3 or M2. There might be a chance that Apple still keeps one of those versions as a cheaper version in the lineup, because don't forget, right now we have the M2 and the M3 MacBook Air coexisting as cheaper alternatives to the M4 MacBook Pro, the M4 Pro MacBook Pro, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if we got like an M4 MacBook Air, but then still kept either the M2 or the M3, And which one would probably more depend, I would argue, on supply. Like, Apple might not have as many M3 chips anymore. At that point, it wouldn't make sense to keep selling the MacBook Air M3, or they might have too many M3s for all we know, and that's why they might be making an M3 iPad Air. So that one I really couldn't answer you without having some insight of the supply. We know that Apple basically stopped ordering N3B chips from TSMC. That includes chips like the A17 Pro and the M3 generation of processors, but I don't know how many they ordered. If they are either already running out of them completely, except for maybe enough to make the iPad Air, or if they have so many oversupplied that they just look to sell it in at least some way, shape, or form at this point. So this is also coming from Mark Gurman. He does not here fully commit to an exact day as he does with the iPhone SE4, or at least a certain week, but he does basically imply. I wouldn't actually be surprised if maybe by Sunday and the time his Power Run newsletter comes out, if Mark Gurman comes out and says, you know what, I just talked about the supply of the MacBook Air and the iPad Air dwindling. There is a chance that Apple might launch them this week too. The MacBook Air M4, we expected to get an extra Thunderbolt port, probably hopefully on the other side, so that would match the M4 MacBook Pro. It would get all the power improvements and efficiency improvements over the M3, and it would be able to supply multiple displays at once with display stream. So you could have your MacBook and you could have it output simultaneously to two displays without having to close the laptop lid. So no huge changes, but M4 is still a nice performance upgrade. We definitely expect it to keep up the 16 gigabytes of base memory as we had now with the M2 MacBook Air, the M3 MacBook Air, and the M4 MacBook Pro as they were all simultaneously updated. And maybe some more storage. I mean, it's very likely it will stay at 256 gigabytes unless we'll see maybe like $100 price increase. That is not something that leakers have yet commented on. You can, of course, let me know if you yourself would be interested, what kind of configuration you would then be most likely to get, right? That's the kind of stuff, because the MacBook Air is just not something I will ever buy for myself. So I'm just interested in what kind of tech you guys are using. Some rumors have suggested the iPad Air will have the M3 chip that's a step behind the M4 in the iPad Pro, but Gurman said in January that Apple could opt for the M4 instead. And it's once again these like woulda, shoulda, coulda stuff where honestly Mark Gurman didn't say much. And to be quite honest, if he's saying that in January, even for a product that would have launched by April, I think that if Mark Gurman knew exactly, he would just know it, right? It wouldn't be a could. It's not something that Apple could change last minute. Like if they plan to launch this product and it's most likely being produced already, then we know which chip they're using. So that's just funny to me. Ramon is saying, I'm waiting for M4 MacBook Air. You're saying M4 Air. I assume MacBook Air, because they will reduce price of MacBook Air M3. True. At that point, though, I would probably recommend you look at the M3 MacBook Air through like third-party stores, because they will have like some really big clearance sales, right? So they can fully switch to the M4 as like their main seller. And at that point, you could probably get the M3 for like $200-300 less. Than at Apple. I mean, Apple will probably either drop it by $100 or they'll stop selling it and keep the M2 version as the cheaper version. Again, that has everything to do with supply. Because DM2 is based on TSMC's 5 nanometer node, and though that is much cheaper than 3 nanometer, but also more importantly, it's still being produced, while TSMC's first generation 3 nanometer node, as we call it, N3B is not really anymore produced. It's all basically switched over to N3E, which has better yields, slightly lower density, but actually slightly better efficiency. Seems to clock better as we look at the M4 versus the M3 generation and the A18 versus the A17 generation. So yeah, however you want to see it, to me it just makes sense that we'll see either one. I probably wouldn't be surprised if we actually ended up with the M2 MacBook Air still being like $899, and then maybe no, it's actually, I believe it's $999 in the US, and then the M4 could maybe then get slight price increase to like $1199, making a bigger gulf between it and the M2 version, maybe justifying finally giving it more base storage. Basically, that's how I'm thinking, but I do not have any data to go on by. This is, like, I always try to think like Apple while also simultaneously trying to be a bit more generous than Apple would be. Just a tiny bit. Like, I'm never suggesting that Apple just blindly double storage and RAM, even though they kind of did with the M4 generation. I was almost more on the side of them giving 12 gigs of RAM. But yeah, for now, it's not super clear. Ramon, I think MacBook Air M4 8-core will be $1,000. No, because the M3 right now is $1,099, is it not? Because that what you're suggesting would represent a price reduction, and that to me just wouldn't make too much sense, right? So let's look at the Mac pricing here. MacBook Air by, yeah, so the M3 already starts at $1,099. And that's the binned version. So my assumption is that this would basically be one-to-one replaced, but with the M4, except for the different CPU configuration. I'm not sure what kind of binning Apple would target here. Yes, but M2 Air was $1,200 for some time. True, but the M2 Air was a redesign. That's what was justified the initial price increase in Apple's eyes, but actually in the eyes of consumers, the fact that it still started with 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, really reduced its attractiveness. Now Apple has already given us 16 gigs of RAM as base. And I don't think Apple wants to down the average sales price. If anything, what I could see, if Apple like this $12.99 version, I could see Apple making it more like $11.99, but then just get rid of the cheapest version, right? All to slightly increase the average sales price, similar to what they did with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, right? The 256 gigabyte version of the iPhone 15 Pro Max costs just as much money, $11.99, as the 256 gigabyte version of the 14 Pro Max, and before that, the 13 Pro Max, right? But what they did instead, but what they did also is they cut off the 128 gigabyte version that was previously $10.99, right? So imagine if you got a version with these specs, but also M4, and it was a little bit cheaper, right? $50, $100. I think that would be pretty good. And at that point, Apple could maybe reduce the M2 price to $8.99 and then keep it with 256 gigs of storage. But again, all of this is speculation at this point. I know 256 gigabytes at $10.99 is pretty bad, but that is what it makes Apple's margins, right? Apple's like 35-40% hardware margin never come from their base versions. These devices often have like margins in their 20s. it's when Apple gets margins closer to like 45 or 50% in higher end versions. It's where it all evens out. Apple gets to a profit margin they're overall more comfortable with. Believe me, I do not like that. It's not like, but I do understand it's not going to change, especially not after Apple has shown with the M4 MacBook Pro that honestly, it doesn't take too much in terms of value improvement to get people to buy stuff. My speculation is we'll get double the base storage with the M5 generation. So the way I see it, the M5 is not going to be a huge change over the M4. It's going to be on TSMC's N3 P node. So performance, 5 to 10% more performant or more efficient, depending on how Apple chooses to spend the silicon budget and the clock speeds, right? And I think by that point, it could make sense to do something like maybe increase prices by $100, but then let everything start at 512 gigabytes. So, for example, the MacBook Air at that point would be $1199, but with 512 gigs of storage. The Mac Mini would be $699 rather than $599. But it would all still be $100 cheaper for 512 gigabytes than it was before, because right now it's $1299 that you have to spend to get 512 gigabytes on the more powerful MacBook Air. You have to spend $800 on a Mac Mini to get 512 gigs of storage. So it would be a little bit of a compromise, similar to what they pulled off with the M4 Mac Mini. Not saying it's perfect. They definitely should have 512 gigabytes in these configurations, in those cheaper ones. But again, this is where they make their margins. So, and I don't see that changing, not especially after seeing how good their sales have been for both the iPad and the MacBook last quarter. And speaking of the iPad, if we actually look at the current state of the lineup, there are actually a few things that I believe are really worth changing. First, for the iPad Air, it really does depend on how much Apple wants it to sell. I think that both RAM and storage are kind of okay, especially on the 11-inch model. I wish the 13-inch model gave us a little bit more than just a larger screen. I think paying $200 for like a 2-inch larger screen, and it's not the best screen, right? It's not ProMotion. It's definitely not OLED. It's definitely not very bright. Now, granted, the 13-inch model does have a slightly brighter screen at 600 nits, but that's also not a very big difference here. It's also not Apple's highest density display. So, if anything, maybe Apple could give us 256 gigs on the 13-inch model. I think that could help it sell well. But if they are just moving it upwards one generation, to be honest, it will probably help enough. Keep it in the like YouTube talk cycle for a little bit, but then the true enthusiasts will just choose the iPad Pro anyway, and those who are truly interested in a value device will choose whatever new like cheap iPad there will be. That's also interesting because we are expecting a new cheap iPad, most likely A16 based. For a while we thought, oh, maybe it could get an A18 chip with Apple Intelligence. I doubt that at this point. Apple is producing A16 chips on 4 nanometer right now in the United States. So I wouldn't be surprised if Apple wants to go to Trump and tell them, look, we have this iPad. It's made with chips made in America, right? Please don't do tariffs, bro. Yeah, overall, not a bigger change. If anything, the more interesting thing here, in my opinion, would be what they do or don't do with the Magic Keyboard, right? Because right now it costs the same $349 as does the Magic Keyboard for the iPad Pro, but it does not have a function row. It has a smaller trackpad, right? So it's just overall worse value. Not only is it priced the same but worse, but it's also designed to connect to a product that is much cheaper than the M4 iPad Pro. So it's just like, it completely percentage-wise makes, in my opinion, no sense to buy a $350 accessory to a $600 product, right, or an $800 product. While as for the iPad Pro, since you are already starting at $1,000, the more expensive version is $1,300. I do believe it kind of makes sense to just, that one with $350 accessory still can make some sense in my opinion. Now, speaking of that M4 iPad Pro, I actually do believe we also deserve some changes over there, but I do not think that they will be too crazy. So I think we're keeping basically the same hardware, that beautiful tandem OLED screen, that way too thin of a body, those slight design changes, whatever. But I do believe when it comes to making it high value, Apple needs to switch around some stuff here. And my suggestion would be give it 16 gigabytes of RAM, right? Make it the same as the M4 Max, right? Or now all Macs, right, are starting with 16 gigabytes. While I do believe that iOS, iPadOS are more efficient operating system than macOS, I do not think they justify like having half as much memory. 12 gigabytes I could get. 8 gigabytes at $1,000, at $1,300, I really do not. Especially not with a chip as powerful as the M4, especially not if you're already creating bundles where you have higher storage configurations coming with more memory, right? So what I'm basically advocating for, 16 gigabytes across both models, and my suggestion would be that the 13-inch model, if Apple wants to keep it at a very high-priced $300 price difference, then in my opinion, they need to give it the fully enabled M4 chip, no matter the storage configuration, right? Right now, if you get the 256 or 512 gig version, you actually do have a slightly bent CPU. 3 performance cores, 6 efficiency cores, and I do believe that at the very least the 13-inch model deserves to have the full 10-core CPU, no matter whether you get it with 256 gigabytes. And yes, we can discuss whether or not 256 gigabytes is kind of insulting at $1,300 already. But definitely give us at least those like $50 worth of extra cores, right? You could even justify it by saying, you know what? The chip is so efficient. On the 13-inch version, we have so much more cooling. It just makes sense to give every storage configuration more cores, and then on the 11-inch version you could still keep the differentiation between like 1 terabyte version, 2 terabyte versions having different core configurations. More memory, no longer, unless Apple might want to include like a 24 gigabyte RAM version on the 1 or 2 terabyte configurations, but that would be overkill. I'm not sure if the market really needs it. I think many people are still plenty happy even with just 8 gigabytes on the Mac. Going to 16 standard will definitely be a nice to have, and then 24 even in higher end versions I think would just be seen as overkill. Again, all of this is speculation. Some of it is just based on like common sense and just like what I believe, like how Apple operates, right? You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, and of course you can let me know what kind of pricing you kind of expect for it to make sense for you, but I'm just trying to keep expectations a little bit lower. Now, going back to the iPhone SE 4, we have already talked about most spec points here. First and foremost, it would be based on the A18 chip. The reason I say first and foremost, even though most likely the thing you actually see first would be that 6.1-inch OLED screen rather than the 4.7-inch LCD screen, I think that the A18 chip matters probably most for Apple because it enables Apple Intelligence. It also is a very costly upgrade to integrate, obviously, over the A15 chip that's currently inside the iPhone SE 3, and it would come therefore also with 8 gigabytes of memory, which is the baseline as far as we understand to support Apple Intelligence. With that, of course, it would also double the memory over the current iPhone SE, so definitely not a cheap upgrade. Now, looking again at Apple's website, one thing that I do believe really needs to be updated in some way, shape, or form is also the storage. The storage on the iPhone SE, let's go midnight, right, currently starts at 64 gigabytes. It costs only $50 to get up to 128. So my expectation would kind of be, maybe if Apple is kind of generous by their standards, they would give us a $499 model, but with 128 gigabytes. And I think that given that it would have the same chip basically as the iPhone 16 and 16 Plus, it would have the same base storage configuration, the same RAM as the iPhone 16, 16 Plus. I actually do believe that $500 would be pretty cool. Now, Apple could do something weird. Maybe they make it start at $479, but then they give it 64 gigabytes of storage. I do not believe that 64 gigabytes is acceptable, though, and part of it also comes back to the Apple Intelligence marketing, right? Because Apple already gives us so much more memory than before, especially here, right? Doubling the RAM. And they did the same with the iPad mini without increasing pricing at all. So in my opinion, it just makes sense to do this. Slight price increase, more of everything. And I do believe that this would be a product that you could keep selling for a long period of time. Maybe drop the price by $50 in a year or two or something like that. But the reason why 64 gigabytes is not acceptable is Apple Intelligence takes up like 7-8 gigabytes on your device. Maybe by the time you have really modern large language models, maybe you actually want to have the LLMs for 2 or 3 languages on your device. Granted, at that point you should probably go pro. But at that point you would be giving up like over a tenth of your storage, more like an eighth. And that is just not something that I believe is acceptable. It's a feature that Apple wants you to use. It's a feature that Apple believes will get you to buy their product. But then it's also a feature that eats up your storage so fast, if it is only 64 gigabytes, that it just feels insulting. Like, honestly, I do believe that both 17 and 17 Air should come with 256 gigabytes base. I'm fine with 256 gigabytes base on the Pro because I know many people with a Pro phone still use it in very basic ways, and they use like iCloud storage, and many don't play games. Most don't save music or TV shows or movies on their devices, so they use everything from the cloud anyway. So 256 gigabytes to me on iPhones is completely fine. It's mostly fine on iPads. It's not very fine at all on most Macs. So it's a little bit of like, it's a case-by-case basis. So, and again, I do try to also see it from Apple's perspective. I do not suggest they launch a product that entirely ends up cannibalizing potentially iPhone 16 sales by being way too good and way too cheap at the same time. Now, speaking of other specs, it would have, of course, full screen design, OLED 6.1 inch screen, higher pixel density, higher brightness, better HDR handling, notch versus big top and bottom bezels with no home button. Bella, you want to say hi, or you just want to risk throwing down my laptop? Come here. Meow, 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 meow. Want to say hi? So that's hi, even though I think she will start scratching me. And now she can go on the floor, but softly. Don't be angry with me. Also, don't push your hair directly into my nose. So then there's the 5G modem. Again, we do know it's going to be pretty limited in that regard, so it's not going to support millimeter wave, but neither does, by the way, the current iPhone SE support millimeter wave, so in that way it's by no means a downgrade. The current iPhone SE also uses a pretty old modem, so even if Apple's current modem might not be very competitive with the current gen of Qualcomm's modems, it probably will do a pretty good job versus that older chip. And of course, there is the camera discussion. 48 megapixel single camera. Most likely Apple will advertise this as having two zoom ranges, right? So a native 48 megapixel that bends down to 24, and a 12 megapixel mode where you just zoom in 2x, so half on each axis, right? 1/4 of the image, 1/4 of 48 megapixels is 12 megapixels. And because Apple sees 12 megapixels as kind of a native resolution, they'll claim that's a lossless zoom. Obviously, that's bullshit, but that is what kind of smartphone brands are going for these days. Like Samsung, for example, they have like their 50 megapixel 5x telephoto, but then they will also have a 10x right in the viewfinder, with basically the argument being that, oh, you can still zoom in on a nice 12 megapixel part of that image and it will still look better than maybe even Apple's like 12 like older sensor in their telephoto, right? Again, it's not correct marketing, but it's something that people kind of understand. Not supporting this, but yeah, you can take it as you want. I'm not here to discuss Apple's marketing. We've talked about some stuff about it. I actually do recommend you guys go back to my reaction to Tylosov Tech's video on this. Where he talked about Apple kind of being the new IBM, being more run by like marketing people, and I've been kind of like trying to deconstruct those arguments because I do not actually think they're good faith. Mohammed Abdullah saying great news. Yeah, I actually do believe that it's great news to have like very distinct upgrades, right? Like, look, of course the iPad Air might not be a huge performance upgrade, but let's say it works with a better Magic Keyboard, and it also simplifies the logistics for Apple if it happens to be compatible with the same Magic Keyboard as the M4 iPad Pro, right? That to me already adds value throughout across the board. Then the M4 MacBook Air, it's not only more powerful, but it also gives you that multiple display support that for years something that people have been asking for. And then of course the iPhone SE, pretty much no matter what happens exactly, for a while we've heard rumors that it might be like even getting a dynamic island, but no matter what Apple does, it is going to be an upgrade over this. And pretty much no matter how it's priced, even if it's $479 but with 64 gigabytes, in my opinion, for today's day and age, it will be way better value than this device is at $429 with 64 gigabytes, than it is at $479 with 128. And then I think the 256 gigabyte configuration is kind of stupid. If you are willing to pay almost $600 for an iPhone, you should be looking at like a used or refurbished, or maybe just a discounted older model. You definitely should not be looking at a 4.7-inch LCD iPhone with like an 1800 milliamp hour battery, right? The iPhone SE4 is rumored, for example, to get the battery of pretty much exactly the iPhone 14. It's because it has pretty much the exact same chassis size, thickness, a lot of similar components. So if we look at it, I believe it was like 3260 or something like that. iPhone 14 battery capacity 3279. So wouldn't be surprised if it's pretty much identical to that. Yes, it wouldn't get like the fastest charging ever, wouldn't get the best speakers ever by modern standards, but I do not think it is needed for a device at that price. So I definitely do believe that whatever Apple does, just the battery capacity increase, plus, of course, that beautiful OLED panel is going to justify even a small price increase. Then you combine the massive performance increase, more memory, support for Apple Intelligence, and Apple could probably justify a price increase better than some people realize. Especially since I do believe that once you also start talking about a much better camera, don't forget the current iPhone SE does not even support night mode. Right, let's go to the tech specs here of the iPhone SE, as it currently is, an abomination on the lineup in my opinion. So looking at the camera, 12 megapixel f1.8 digital zoom, which here Apple would claim 48 megapixel, probably also f by 1.8, and then they would claim basically like lossless 2x zoom. Portrait modes, optical image stabilization, sapphire crystal lens. You see, no night mode or anything like that. Also, none of the crazy AI-based features for like tuning audio quality the way you do. Definitely a lot of room for improvement. Also, IP67 probably being upgraded to IP68. 625 nits brightness probably being. I actually don't remember what was the peak brightness of the iPhone 14. Peak brightness. So 1,000 nit. No, that's the pros. Man, can you really not just give me the... So it's 800 nits, but that's 100%. Okay, so it would probably be advertised as like 800 nits. I wouldn't be surprised if Apple might even just like downgrade some cooling stuff versus the iPhone 14 just to get some components cheaper. Apple advertises 1200 nits of peak brightness. Yeah, but that's on a small portion of the screen. So unless it uses like a newer panel, like from the iPhone 15, but basically in the iPhone 14's body, then I could see that happening. But for now, yeah, you can also see, by the way, the one standout here, the one device not using OLED, therefore having a limited contrast ratio, being the iPhone SE from 2022. But definitely, whatever Apple does, it's still going to be an upgrade over the current iPhone SE. And if they manage to still get into the brightness range of like the 13 Pro, that's still, in my opinion, pretty good. But yeah, definitely, by the way, you can see some weird data here, like 13. Oh, no, that is max auto. Okay, so it's just a huge generational increase from 13 to 14 Pro. Well, yeah, that lines up with the truth. Yeah, this is when Apple also started talking about like 2000 nits on their Pro models. And then I actually think that the iPhone 15 also had 2000 nits advertised, right, for its screen. Yeah, so 16 to 1800, that's what Apple would then basically advertise as 2000 nits. So yeah, thank you, GSM Arena. I've relied on you quite a lot recently, and you haven't yet disappointed me. So Face ID versus Touch ID. I know some people are always advocating for the return of Touch ID. Honestly, as long as there is one good biometric system, the Apple is definitely not putting two biometric systems inside the SE. Like if they ever do it, it's going to be like a Pro feature, maybe even like a Pro Max exclusive thing. But yeah, on the SE, you're only ever getting one system. Yeah, so, and then the front camera, very likely to be the current generation of front-facing camera, so a 12 megapixel system, which would also put it nicely below the capabilities of the upcoming iPhone 17 lineup, because those would then be getting 24 megapixel front-facing selfies. So Apple might make this device very attractive, even in comparison to like the 16 and 16 Plus. But then by the time the 17 series comes out, their more expensive models start looking more attractive again. And then since Apple keeps around the same SE for like 3 years, by the time the 18 series comes out, that's where like the mix of sales once again starts favoring by an incredible margin the regular models, the Pro models. I do not think that the SE will like long-term cannibalize sales of like their mid-range, even though Apple's mid-range is priced as high as like the OnePlus 13. So yeah, but definitely if it launches next week, I hope Apple does a good job advertising it. Hope they really focus on stuff beyond Apple Intelligence, because I know so many people in the tech community just get irrationally angry whenever they hear about any AI stuff. I don't like AI stuff, but too much, but I kind of glance over when it's mentioned a lot. It reminds me a bit of like when 5G was coming out for the iPhone 12 series. I was like, yeah, I'm interested in 5G, but there's only so often you can mention it at stage for me to get excited about it, right? I will only really feel it once I actually have it in my hand, once my carrier does a good job supporting it. And I feel similar about Apple Intelligence. I want new features based on large language models, features like cleanup, for example, or the new writing tools. And even I love absolutely Genmoji on my Mac, which my iPad and my iPhone do not get Apple Intelligence because I am in Germany, I am in the European Union, and am unfortunately having to deal with all the compromises that come with that, even though there are a lot of upsides too. But yeah, for me here, definitely the highlight is the screen for me personally. I think for marketing, it's going to be the A18 chip and Apple Intelligence. I think for most people, the battery will actually be the thing that redefines the way they would use like an old iPhone SE versus this iPhone. And then for everyone else, there's the camera to be upgraded. There's USB-C, which is not just good, of course, for regulatory purposes, but I do believe that most consumers see USB-C as a nice upgrade to have these days. Yeah, and for everything else, for all the details, the exact real-life battery life, whether or not the A18 here might perform a little worse than it does on the iPhone 16, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if this one might have like one GPU core disabled, right? The A18 chip inside the iPhone 16 and 16 Plus has 5 GPU cores versus the A18 Pro's 6 GPU cores. However, the A18 is not a binned A18 Pro. It's actually a separate die, around like 20% smaller to make or something like that, maybe even just 15, but Apple still saw it as worthwhile at making it into a separate die. So I wouldn't be surprised if Apple said, oh, now that we are so efficient in like creating dies, the yields are probably nigh perfect for like a under 100 square millimeter N3E die. They might say, you know what? If we have anything that's broken on it, that can go in the iPhone SE4. Clocks like 2-3% lower, iPhone SE4. 1 GPU core disabled, iPhone SE4. Right? And I do believe this will make this device very economical. I think even for the use of their own modems, they could apply lower quality standards for it than they would on higher end models, right? I'm not talking about the eventual like millimeter wave supporting much faster modem with much better aggregation of multiple carrier stuff. I'm just talking maybe like in a higher end model, they would target the modem to support like 400 megabytes per second. That's a completely arbitrary number, not saying that's what's happening here, right? But then the iPhone SE, certain versions only like support 300. They just don't clock that nicely, right? Apple is like, oh, you know what? We're gonna just downclock the entire batch for this version, for this specific device. It will be more efficient. and we'll have to do like less like chip differentiation, and we'll save some money that way. So yeah, I do believe there are a lot of corners that will be cut on the iPhone SE4 relative to, of course, the more expensive models. Apple does not want to make this too great of a value, but I do believe this will still be a pretty good product. Again, we've talked already about the iPad Air, the MacBook Air. Those will be comparably smaller upgrades, but still deliver some features and improvements that people have been asking for. Primarily, of course, referring to the multiple screen support for the MacBook Air, and an extra port obviously helps. That to me, for example, is a big deal. Like the way I use my stuff during streaming, I usually have my charge port and all three USB-C ports filled. So one connects to my iPhone, charges it, allows the iPhone to transmit the continuity camera stuff to my laptop wired rather than wireless. I have my earpods to listen to to whatever I'm watching on YouTube, and sometimes I use it as a microphone, but usually my last USB-C port is then reserved for my high-end Shure microphone. So to me, the MacBook Air right now would actually not be very usable as a streaming product, even though it would have all the power I would need for that. So for now, I would be reliant on the MacBook Pro, which I am. I do have the M1 Max 14-inch MacBook Pro back from 2021. So it's also like closing in, well, it's 3.5 years old basically. But for the MacBook Air, I think that would make it more attractive to people who are not really super duper pro, not maybe even interested in stuff like mini LED screens or promotions, but they're just like, oh, you know what, one extra port helps. I do not think actually the majority of MacBook Air owners will want to connect it to two external monitors simultaneously, but hey, now you could if you wanted to. So, and the iPad Air compatibility with maybe the Magic Keyboard of the M4 iPad Pro, a little bit more performance, supposedly a new Wi-Fi modem. Let's see how that performs. We haven't yet heard Mark Gurman double down recently on the rumors he has talked about like last year at this point. So it will be interesting as we get closer to their release if he might do like a last minute dump of like the exact product details that we should expect. In fact, let me briefly check if maybe while I'm talking I might have missed something. Doesn't seem that way. Yeah. So yeah, this is just more opinion piecing. Of course, the modem does matter, but I do not think it's actually going to be a big deal for consumers. Yeah, that being said, that's about it for what we should expect based on these kind of like this one big rumor, and then a little bit of extra detail about like iPad Air and MacBook Air supplies dwindling, which does lead us to think about the possibilities of what that could mean. But then there is also one other thing, and I'm actually not sure if I can play the video. I'm not sure if there's any copyright to it. But Apple basically made a lamp robot. And this is interesting because Mark Gurman and others have talked about the potential that Apple would be getting a little bit more into robotics. And this is kind of like their first major example that they're providing to the public. They're using it as a lamp, so you can see it moves around, makes like your reading experience better. It responds to some hand movements, but most importantly, what Apple is trying to show here is that it's very expressive, right? It almost behaves a little bit like a puppy, like whittling its tail. So it's very expressive, feels more emotional, and I think that's the main gist that Apple is trying to convey here. The idea is not that this is the most revolutionary. I've already heard people say bullshit like, oh, you know what Boston Dynamics does or what the Tesla robot does. It's like, yeah, this is not designed to be that. In fact, Apple specifically talks about it. They call this elegant, and they call this expressive and functional movement designed for non-anthropomorphic robots. So this is specifically for robots that do not look like humans, non-humanoid robots, basically. Non-verbal behaviors such as posture, gestures, and gaze are essential for conveying internal states, unless you're super duper autistic. But yeah, usually non-verbal communication is extremely important for us humans, both consciously and unconsciously, or subconsciously, I would argue, rather than unconsciously. For robots to interact more naturally with humans, robot movement design should likewise integrate expressive qualities such as intention, attention, and emotions, alongside traditional functional considerations like task fulfillment, spatial constraints, and time efficiency. So Apple basically made a paper on how they believe the next gen of robotics, something that also should be available to consumers, right? Because obviously if they're working in like a sterile construction zone or whatever, you don't need a robot arm to be moving around too much and kind of like wiggling its tail for you. You just want it to do its job. So Apple is specifically talking about here how it would basically drive more interactivity from humans to actually use a robot once you make it basically a little bit cuter, right? And there is stuff like that where people like sometimes give like robots like an extra screen with like doodly eyes. But basically Apple is here more about like showing the movement side of that equation. Obviously, I mean, theoretically Apple could have like an LED panel or OLED panel on there that shows like eyes or whatever, gives you a smile. Whenever it might talk, maybe if you combine it with like an AI, then it could even show like a moving mouth. But that's not what they're doing. This is obviously a nice start. This obviously reminds you of like the Pixar lamp, right? That moves around and jumps around. So that makes a lot of sense for Apple to be inspired by that. Obviously, Steve Jobs having a very strong historical connection to Pixar, the company being very close to Apple, then being bought up by Disney. Therefore also making Apple closer to Disney. So I'm not surprised that they were inspired by that. I wouldn't be surprised if they had obviously much more advanced robotics going on in the background, research and development, but this is what they're showing to the public. This is what they're writing like white papers for. But I would believe that like a consumer product based on the principles they're describing here is still pretty far off. Bella, please don't throw around my laptop. The only thing that I could conceivably see as coming in the near-term future that shows some of those characteristics is actually that long-rumored HomePad. HomePad, Apple rumor. And that is basically the HomePod combined with like a small iPad display. So maybe there could be like a mock-up somewhere. Yeah, basically like this, right? So this would be on an moving arm, a little bit more like this, right? So if maybe they can use the screen to show some form of intent, obviously this wouldn't be picking up anything for you, but if it does maybe do some like wiggling around to show you, oh, I'm happy or whatever, please give me a command, then honestly I think that would be quite cool. Obviously it would have to be a pretty sturdy arm that could potentially add a lot to the cost of the product. Apple does like to charge quite nicely for like more expensive mechanical parts. Do I need to remind you, of course, of one of the most famous examples, Pro Display Stand, snazzy.
Dude, it's so frustrating. Like, people just don't get it. I mean, is $1,000 really that much money for a monitor stand? I mean, what even is $1,000? Brunch with the boys at the Waldorf? Big whoop. I get that $1,000 is a lot of money for some people, but like, dude, you're framing it wrong. This isn't just a monitor stand. And thinking of it that way, it's short-sighted. It transcends function. And really, I mean, it's a piece of art.
And it's $1,000. That's the main point. And that is one stand with one somewhat articulated arm. Now, granted, that stand is out of aluminum, which is not a very expensive material. I think we calculated once, like how much it weighs and how much that aluminum will cost, and it was like $20 at the very most. Not even considering like massive mass purchase discounts potentially. Yeah, it has some decent magnets here to attach the screen, but this thing is obviously ridiculously priced. When we were talking about like $10.99 for a product with 256 gigabytes of storage, well, this is $9.99 for a product with 0 gigabytes of storage. So I just wonder how it would work to have an Apple device with an even more articulate arm, but granted, it wouldn't have to have a lot of counterweights because that front screen would be fixed in weight and size. It would also not be very big in comparison to like the Pro Display XDR. But it just would be funny, like, because now you're looking at a potentially high-end speaker, if it is more designed to replace the big HomePod rather than the HomePod Mini. The current HomePod is $300. Now add Apple's ridiculous pricing for potentially like an A18 chip with 8 gigs of RAM to make it Apple Intelligence compliant. Not sure, maybe it would rely on your iPhone for Apple Intelligence tasks, but I'm just saying there is potential for that. Then add a screen to it. Yes, it wouldn't be the best screen ever, like potentially only $20, but that's cost. And now add that articulate arm. So are we talking about the $1,000 HomePad at that point? I'm not sure. Obviously, that would price it completely differently than like the Home Nest shit and stuff like that, and the Amazon Alexas with their screens. But it's just funny to me that we even have to consider potentially ridiculous price points like these, because stuff like that exists. And don't call me too crazy here. Like, yeah, obviously this is the most ludicrous example. I mean, it is good value though from one perspective, right? Which is that if you try holding it up with $1,000, it actually does work better than using paper money. The more you know, right? But if we actually go again to apple.com, there's another product with a somewhat articulate arm in Apple's, and that is the where is it? It's just displays, for 2 displays. Okay, Apple. So the Studio Display with MSRP starts at $15.99, charges you a not so generous $300 for nano texture glass. But hey, that's at least kind of unique. But now when you actually want a stand that does some good shit, and by shit I mean it's height adjustable, you have to pay $400. And that's not versus a display without a stand. You're not paying $400 for the stand. You're paying $400 for the height adjustable capabilities of that slightly different stand. You still get it with a standard stand that has about the same amount of aluminum, slightly less, but it's only tilt adjustable, so it has like a hinge from which you can like move your screen here and here. And if for height adjustable, you're paying $400 more. So it articulates on that angle, right, allowing you to adjust height, but it's a very small amount, unfortunately. It does feel pretty smooth, but not $400 smooth. For $400 in the PC space, you can actually get entire monitors that include a stand that is tilt, height adjustable, and gives you actually more choice in height, and also gives you the option to sometimes tilt the entire screen 180 degrees, which this one doesn't. Like the Pro Display XDR does that, but this one doesn't, even if it makes you pay $400 more. So in my opinion, the smartest thing is either to get the regular version or the Visa mount adapter. Because with the Visa mount adapter, you could get like a stand for $150. That's very high end relatively, and gives you better tilt height adjustment and even more stuff. But again, that's up to everyone. But I'm just saying, when people are talking about robotics from Apple and premium moving parts from Apple, right now they're charging a lot. Now, we could get to a point where just the volume that they're targeting for those more advanced mechanical parts gets higher, so it gets a lot cheaper to make for them for like each individual thing. So we'll get big price discounts. But even if this was half the price as an upgrade, it still would be relatively insulting in comparison to everything else on the market. Realistically, this is how it should come at $15.99. Realistically, even at $15.99 already, it should be at least a ProMotion screen, right? Now, maybe for the build quality, maybe I can justify some like cheaping out, maybe like not being ProMotion, but I definitely cannot expect charging us $400 for a slightly better stand. Bella, what are you doing? My cat is like getting anxious because I keep talking. And, she's like, do something. Since when are you talking so much? Yeah, but again, just trying to give you the worst case scenario. While I don't think Apple wants to charge the incredible profit margins for the HomePad that they do for specifically like an optional accessory, I do still believe that they will not make it too cheap to get what they would consider like a premium mechanical part from Apple. At least that's how I see it. Yeah, let me briefly look. Yeah, that's not greatest news in my opinion. If we just look at precedent from Apple, but yeah, so I just really wanted to cover that cute robot because I do believe it's interesting. Again, I'm not going to play the video. I'm not going to read the white paper for you. Please check it out for yourself. Apple is talking a lot more openly about certain things. Like, they will not discuss like ideas for future iPhones in the same way they are AI stuff or robotic stuff. And quite honestly, the reason for that mainly comes down to the fact that Apple needs high quality, highly qualified employees in those areas, and those employees are very much asked for, right? They're like half a dozen big Chinese brands that are working on fully humanoid robots. Tesla tries to build shit like that, right? So while I do trust usually Apple more with execution than Tesla, I do have to say that they do have to compete for that labor force. And with AI, it's kind of even worse because you have NVIDIA that pays you like $800,000 a year to sometimes work basically half time, as long as they get to like take away the most qualified AI engineers so they don't go to like AMD or whatever. And then of course you can work at OpenAI and on ChatGPT. You can work at Google and on Gemini. You can work at Microsoft and work on a slightly modified version of ChatGPT. You can work at Facebook, Meta, and work on their AI. You can now work in China and work on whatever AI like a company like a DeepSeek have, right? So again, though I don't think the DeepSeek is the name of the company, it's just the name of the AI. That's not what matters. But I'm just saying that if you are ever curious, why is Apple more open talking about some future tech than others? That comes down to that their advantage in smartphones, tablets, laptops, that's something they definitely do not want to disclose, while they're not that great of a position and stuff like AI and robotics. That's something they do want to talk about what their more unique perspective is, like a bigger focus on like human interactivity, right? Because Apple does know how to get humans to interact more with their technology. They've built successful user interfaces. They redesigned them time and time again and still had very high customer satisfactions. I know some people don't like the Photos app, but I would still argue it's pretty good UI. So this is what they're focusing on, right? They're not saying they have like the best hinges, the best electrical systems in there. And I don't think that will be the focus once they actually launch something robotic. So it's going to be interesting. I do not think anything will match the size of the iPhone. Like we've heard that already when Apple launched Apple Vision Pro and people discuss, oh my God, it failed, didn't sell too much and whatever. But then we look at sales across the VR industry and we find like, hey, you know what, for a $3,500 product, it kind of did okay. And now they're still working on it, giving it new versions of Vision OS. Supposedly they're making it compatible with PlayStation VR 2 controllers. So I do believe that similar to that, maybe a first generation robot from Apple would be like very expensive, very niche. It would be like a show off device that you have on your desk like this. Whether it moves around or it's fixed in place, it listens, it integrates with your iPhone and whatever, and then maybe by the second or third generation they make it smaller, cheaper, more accessible to the public, give it more functionality. So right now Apple is doing very well with the iPhone, the iPad, the Mac, the Apple Watch, their accessory systems, the revenue from their subscriptions and their cloud and whatever. And this is all basically icing on top. None of this is going to replace either humans entirely in the workforce, nor will it replace your smartphone as your main computing device, at least not anytime soon. But it's still fun to see what else Apple is working on. And yeah, speaking of that main compute device, I'll of course keep you informed about whether Apple launches the iPhone SE actually next week. I'll be hopefully there with you to cover it live. I do not have that long of a work week next week, so the days are pretty limited. So actually from like 4 or 5 p.m. of my time, I'll actually be able to stream for you guys. And I assume on the day the iPhone SE4 actually gets announced, it will probably be a longer stream. And then the rest of the week, the stream size will probably depend on if Apple launches actually something else, like the M3 iPad Air, or even according to Mark Gurman, that it might be M4 based. Of course, the M4 MacBook Air, if Apple launches it right now and doesn't wait until like April or something like that. And even to a small degree, though it's not as important, like PowerBeats Pro 2, supposedly coming on February 11th. So that will definitely be interesting. Likely housing the same M2 chip and maybe heart rate monitoring. Again, we've talked about it before on this channel. I'm actually not sure if it's one of the videos that I had to delete the stream of because it was really bad quality because my internet kept on not working. I hope it's not, but regardless, I will cover the PowerBeats Pro 2 next week. That launch seems very much fixed in place. February 11th, $250, using a lot of stuff similar to the AirPods Pro 2. Makes sense in my opinion before Apple then launches AirPods Pro 3, much better by the end of the year. So, and for everybody who is still more like gym and workout focused, for them the PowerBeats Pro 2 will be a very good option. I actually remembered which PowerBeats I had. I actually had the PowerBeats 4, so I had the versions before the PowerBeats Pro. Yeah, I believe that old stream is actually gone, so I'm happy that I still covered this. So I'll be here, of course, to keep covering this next week. I might not be here on Sunday to cover if Mark Gurman launches a Power On newsletter. And then on Monday, I'll definitely wait until like Apple could have launched something, right, time-wise. And then, because it doesn't make sense for me to react to Mark Gurman's Sunday's Power On newsletter on Monday, only for 15 minutes later for then to it start coming true, right? So I will only cover it on Monday if nothing happens on Monday. But I might actually wait just until Tuesday. So I could take 4 days off. Please forgive me for that. But I just really wanted to get it all out of the way, give you a nice plan for next week. I know my streaming schedule can be quite irregular, but I am spending time on this weekend with my family. Actually spending some time early next week. 2 days still here. So hopefully you're happy with the audio and video quality. That's what you'll keep getting as long as I'm here. As always, please leave me suggestions. What else you would like to see me cover next. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. Like the video. Share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Please comment. I know you guys love commenting live, but please also comment afterwards. That helps out with the algorithm. We have some people who really listen well to that, and most people do not. And of course, whenever you catch me live, please consider leaving a small donation in the form of a super chat or a super sticker. You can become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, and Max Maximus, who are all MarkTech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube. Or you can also become a supporter over on Patreon. There are a few different tiers there, including a free one, just so you can easier communicate with me. That's about it for today. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you guys next time. This is MarkTech, tuning out.